The wind moved slowly through the dry grass that covered the hills near the small town of Clearwater. The ranch stood far from the rest of the world, a lonely patch of land where only one man lived. His name was Samuel Harper, a man in his late 30s who had worked this land since he was a boy. His father had died years ago, his mother too, and now he lived alone with his horse, his dog, and his quiet thoughts. Each morning, Samuel woke before sunrise. He would light the stove, boil coffee, and walk outside to check the fences. The sound of the windmill turning was the only thing that reminded him time was moving. He didn't speak much, not because he didn't want to, but because there was no one to speak to. The silence had become part of him. When the mail wagon came once a week, Samuel rarely cared. Most of the time, it was just bills or notices about cattle sales. But one morning, the driver handed him a small envelope written in neat handwriting. Samuel turned it over a few times, wondering who would write to him. When he opened it, his hands trembled slightly. Inside was a letter from an agency in the East, a mail-order bride service. At first, he thought it was a mistake. He had written to them months ago, but he had never expected a reply. The letter said, "Dear Mr. Harper, we are pleased to inform you that a match has been found. Her name is Miss Elena Morris, age 24.
She has agreed to travel to Clearwater and start a new life as your wife. Her train will arrive on the 14th. Samuel read the words again and again. His chest felt tight, not from fear, but from something strange, something close to hope. He looked around at his empty home, the dusty floor, the silent rooms. Maybe it was time. Maybe this was his chance to fill the silence. The days before her arrival passed slowly. Samuel cleaned the house for the first time in months. He fixed the broken step on the porch, painted the door, and even bought a new lamp from town. The shopkeeper, Mr. Boyd, raised an eyebrow when he heard Samuel ask for curtains. Curtain. Sam didn't think you cared for such things. Samuel only nodded and said softly, "Someone's coming." When the day came, the sky was pale and wide. Samuel dressed in his cleanest shirt, brushed the dust off his boots, and rode into town. The train whistle echoed across the valley like a cry. He stood by the platform, feeling like a schoolboy again, unsure of what to say or how to stand. When the doors opened, people stepped off the train one by one. Travelers, merchants, a few families. Then he saw her. She was young, but carried herself with quiet grace. Her dress was simple, pale blue, worn from travel. A small bag hung from her shoulder, and she held a folded letter in her hand, the same one he had sent months ago. Her hair was dark and tied neatly, her face calm but uncertain. When her eyes found Samuel, she hesitated. For a moment, they just looked at each other, two strangers bound by paper promises and silent hope. Then she took a breath and said, "Mr. Harper." He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. You must be Miss Morris." She gave a small, nervous smile. "I suppose I am." He took her bag from her hand gently. "The ride's a bit long to the ranch. Hope you don't mind dust. I've seen worse," she said quietly. The townsfolk watched them as they left, some whispering, others simply curious. Mail-order brides were rare, and most didn't last. But as the wagon rolled away, Elena looked back at the town, disappearing. Behind them, and whispered something only she could hear, as if she were saying goodbye to her old life. The road was long and quiet. They didn't speak much. The air smelled of sage and dust. Occasionally, Samuel pointed out a hill or creek, but mostly silence filled the space between them. Elena watched the land stretch endlessly under the sun. It felt wild, untouched, and a little frightening. By the time they reached the ranch, the sky had turned orange. The small wooden house stood near a barn, a few fences, and a single oak tree. It was simple but solid, like the man who owned it. Samuel helped her down from the wagon. "This will be your home now," he said softly. She looked at it for a long moment, then nodded. "It's quiet," she said. He smiled faintly. "You'll get used to it." Inside, the house was tidy but plain. Samuel had placed flowers in a jar on the table, wild ones, rough but colorful. Elena noticed them and smiled to herself. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than words. That evening, she cooked. Supper, nothing fancy, just stew and bread. They sat across from each other, the lamplight flickering between them. She spoke softly about her journey, how she had lost her parents, how she worked as a teacher before hard times forced her to look for another life. Samuel listened quietly, nodding now and then. When she finished, he said in his deep, quiet voice, "You've been through a lot." She looked down at her hands. We all have, I suppose. They ate in silence after that, but it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. It wasn't empty. It was gentle, almost warm. After supper, Samuel showed her the room he had prepared. The bed was small, but clean, the blanket neatly folded. She stood by the window, looking at the wide-open night, and said softly, "It's beautiful here." He nodded. "It can be lonely, but it's honest." Before leaving her to rest, he stopped at the door and said quietly, "You can call me Samuel." She smiled a little. "Good night, Samuel." He paused, then replied, "Good night, Elena." When he stepped outside, the night air felt different. The stars seemed brighter, the silence softer. He leaned against the porch post, listening to the faint sound of her moving inside the house. For the first time in years, the place didn't feel empty anymore. Inside her room, Elena sat on the edge of her bed. She touched the small cross pendant she wore and whispered a short prayer, not of fear, but of courage. Then she lay down, listening to the wind through the window. That night, both of them stayed awake longer than they should have. He thought of her soft voice and calm eyes. She thought of his steady hands and quiet kindness. Neither of them knew what their future would hold, but for the first time, they were not alone. In the distance, a coyote cried under the moonlight, and Samuel smiled faintly to himself. He had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to wait for another person's voice. Now, as the wind carried the scent of her cooking and the sound of her light steps, he knew his life was about to change. Slowly, quietly, but completely. The prairie was still, the stars endless, and the two strangers now, husband and wife, slept under the same roof for the first time. Neither of them spoke the words that hung between them, but both felt them deeply in their hearts. The beginning of something new, fragile and real. The mornings after Elena's arrival felt different on the ranch. The same sun rose over the same dry hills, yet something had changed. Samuel woke early as always, but now he heard soft footsteps inside the house before he even opened his eyes. The smell of bread baking drifted from the kitchen, mixing with the scent of fresh coffee. For years, Samuel had eaten alone, standing by the window with his plate in hand. Now, there was a woman setting the table for two. Elena was learning the rhythm of the ranch, though it was hard. The land was wide and demanding, and she came from a small town where she had worked as a teacher, not a ranch hand. Her hands blistered quickly from the rough chores. The first time she tried to carry a water bucket, her arms shook so badly she nearly spilled it all. Samuel had stepped forward quietly and said, "Here, let me—" But she shook her head. "I can do it," she said softly, her voice steady despite her trembling arms. Samuel didn't argue. He watched her walk back to the house with the heavy bucket, her dress brushing against the dust. Something in him admired her stubbornness. She didn't complain, not once, even when her palms turned red and raw. The days were long and quiet. Elena washed clothes by the creek, cooked simple meals, and tried to keep the house clean. When she looked out at the endless land, she often felt very small. There was no one to talk to except Samuel, and he spoke only when needed. At night, when he sat by the fire reading an old newspaper, she would knit or write in her small notebook. She wrote letters she never sent, letters to her mother, her father, and the life she once knew. She wrote about the silence, the wind, and the quiet man she now called her husband. Sometimes she felt like a shadow moving through his world, but slowly she began to see small signs that he cared. He fixed the squeaky window in her room without being asked. He left extra wood by her door when nights grew cold. Once, when her hands were too sore to knead the dough, he silently helped her mix it. They didn't speak, but their hands moved together, flour dusting the air like snow. One afternoon, while she was hanging clothes on the line, she heard the sound of a horse galloping fast. When she turned, she saw Samuel riding hard from the field, his face covered in dust. He shouted something she couldn't hear. Then the smell of smoke reached her nose. A wildfire had broken out beyond the ridge. Without thinking, she ran toward the barn. The wind was sharp, carrying sparks across the dry grass. Samuel was trying to release the horses, shouting for them to run. Flames licked the fence line, and the heat grew unbearable. Elena grabbed a bucket, filled it from the trough, and began throwing water on the wood. Her skirt caught an ember, and she slapped it out with her hand burning her palm. Still, she didn't stop. Samuel turned just in time to see a burning branch fall beside her. He ran, pushed her out of the way, and took the hit on his arm. The smell of scorched cloth filled the air. "Get out!" he yelled, his voice rough with smoke. But she didn't run, she wrapped her scarf around his arm and pulled him toward the well. The two of them stumbled through the choking air until they reached open ground. When they finally collapsed near the trough, the sky had turned orange and black. The fire raged behind them, but the main house stood safe. Elena's hands were blistered, and Samuel's arm was badly burned. For a long time, neither spoke. They just sat there breathing hard, their faces stray with soot. That night, Elena refused to rest. She cleaned Samuel's wounds carefully, her eyes focused and calm. He tried to pull his hand away once, but she whispered, "Please, let me do it." Her voice was gentle, but there was strength in it that surprised him. When she finished, she wrapped his arm in cloth and said softly, "You saved me." He looked at her, his voice rough and quiet. "You saved me first." It was the first time they really looked at each other, not as strangers, tied by paper, but as two souls who had faced danger side by side. The silence that followed was not empty. This time, it felt like something new was taking root between them. For the next few days, Elena took over his chores. She fed the horses, mended the fence, and kept the fire going while he healed. Samuel tried to protest, saying she should rest, but she only smiled and said, "I've seen worse days." At night, he would watch her from his chair as she moved quietly through the house. He saw the small things she did, folding his clothes, polishing the lanterns, humming soft tunes while she cooked. There was a warmth in those little moments that filled the rooms like sunlight. One evening, when the sky was painted in gold and red, Samuel stood on the porch watching the horizon. Elena joined him silently, her shawl wrapped tight against the cool wind. "The fire didn't take the house," she said softly. "No," he replied. "It tried." She smiled a little. "Maybe it's stronger than it looks." He turned his head and met her eyes. "Maybe we both are." For a moment, they just stood there watching the light. Fade from the hills. Then he said quietly, "Thank you for what you did. Not many would have stayed." She shook her head. "I didn't think. I just couldn't leave you." Samuel felt something shift inside him, something long buried under years of silence and loneliness. He wanted to say more, but words didn't come easily. Instead, he nodded and said softly, "You're a brave woman, Elena." She looked down, her cheeks warm from more than the setting sun. "I just did what anyone should, but—" He knew that wasn't true. Most would have run. She didn't. That night, when the wind moved gently through the open window, Samuel lay awake thinking about the fire, her steady hands, and her calm eyes. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't known he still could. Trust. Elena, too, lay awake in her room. She thought of the way he had looked at her, not as a burden or a stranger, but as someone who mattered. She had come here believing she was just escaping her past, trading one hard life for another. But now she wondered if maybe she had been sent here for a reason, to mend not just a home but a heart. As days turned to weeks, the land began to heal. The blackened fields grew green again, and the air smelled of rain instead of smoke. Samuel's arm recovered, though the burn left a faint scar. Sometimes she saw him touch it absent-mindedly when he looked her way. Neither of them spoke about the fire again, but it lingered between them like an unspoken promise. From that day forward, their silence changed. It was no longer empty or cold. It became a quiet understanding, a bond built not on words but on shared struggle. And when the wind passed through the hills at night, carrying the faint sound of the horses in the barn, both Samuel and Elena would listen from their separate rooms, each thinking the same simple thought. We're not alone anymore. Weeks turned into months, and the ranch slowly began to recover. The grass grew back after the fire, green and strong. The horses healed, the fences were fixed, and the smoke smell finally faded from the air. Samuel and Elena had fallen into a rhythm. He worked in the fields while she managed the home. But now they spoke more often, shared small jokes, and even laughed sometimes. The loneliness that once filled every corner of the house had been replaced by quiet companionship. One late afternoon, clouds gathered over the valley. The wind began to pick up, tossing dust across the yard. Samuel looked up from the barn and saw the dark sky rolling closer. "Storm's coming," he said. Elena came to the doorway, holding her shawl tight. "Will it be bad?" she asked. He glanced at the horizon and nodded. Could be worse than usual. Together, they hurried to prepare. They brought the horses into the barn, tied down the roof shutters and moved the chickens into the shed. The air grew heavy, and the first drops of rain hit the ground like stones. Soon thunder rolled across the sky, and lightning flashed so bright it lit the fields like daylight. By nightfall, the storm was raging. The rain beat against the roof, and the wind howled like a wild thing. The creek behind the barn began to rise fast, spilling over its banks. Samuel put on his coat and said, "I have to check the corral." Elena caught his arm. "It's too dangerous." But he shook his head. "If the fence goes, we'll lose the cattle." Without another word, he pushed out into the storm. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Elena standing alone in the dim light of the lantern. She waited for what felt like hours, listening to the roar of thunder and the pounding of rain. Every few minutes, she looked toward the window, hoping to see him. Then, through the noise, she heard a sharp crash from outside, the sound of wood breaking. She grabbed a blanket and ran out. The rain was icy cold, soaking her instantly. Lightning flashed, and she saw Samuel struggling by the corral fence. The river water had overflowed, rushing through the field like a small flood. She shouted his name and ran toward him. Together they fought to tie the posts back in place, their hands numb and trembling. At last, the worst passed. The rain slowed, the thunder faded, and the dark clouds began to move away. They were drenched from head to toe, standing in the mud, breathing hard. Samuel looked at her, his hair plastered to his face, and for the first time he smiled, a real smile. "You're soaked," he said. She laughed softly. "So are you." They walked back to the barn for shelter. Inside, it was dim and warm from the breath of the animals. Water dripped from the roof, and the smell of hay filled the air. Samuel sat down on an old crate, rubbing his hands. Elena found a dry cloth and wrapped it around his shoulders. Neither spoke for a long time. The storm outside had left the world quiet again. Finally, Samuel said, "There's something I haven't told you." Elena looked up. "What is it?" He hesitated, his eyes fixed on the floor. "This ranch, it's not as strong as it looks. I'm close to losing it. Before you came, I was behind on taxes. I sent those letters for a wife, not because I wanted company, but because I didn't know what else to do. I thought maybe somehow a new start would help. I didn't expect you to actually come." The confession hung heavy in the air. Rain dripped from the roof in soft rhythm. Elena stood still, trying to find her voice. Then she walked closer and said quietly, You should have told me sooner. I was ashamed, he admitted. You came here expecting a home, not a broken life. She shook her head slowly. I came here because I had nothing left. I didn't expect comfort. I only hoped for a chance to build something new. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she saw not the strong, silent rancher. Everyone respected, but a man who carried more weight than one person should. She knelt beside him, her voice firm and calm. We're alone, Samuel, she whispered. Now, let Sunk do what must be done. The way she said it made him lift his head. There was no pity in her eyes, only determination. You know about numbers, don't you? He asked quietly. I saw you with the ledger. She nodded. I used to teach math. Let me see your accounts. From that night onward, the ranch was no longer his alone. They became a team. Elena spread papers across the kitchen table and began sorting through them. She found where money had been wasted, where supplies could be traded instead of bought. She wrote letters to nearby farmers, offering to sell milk, eggs, and bread. When Samuel doubted her plans, she simply smiled and said, Trust me, we'll manage. And she was right. Within weeks, small changes started to show. The pantry stayed full longer. The neighbors came by more often to trade instead of gossip. The ranch, once quiet and tired, began to feel alive. Samuel worked harder than ever, but now he wasn't working alone. He looked forward to her voice in the morning, her laughter when something went right, her calm tone when things went wrong. When the sun set, they often sat together on the porch, too tired to speak, just watching the light fade over the hills. One evening, when she was checking the books, Samuel walked in and placed a jar of coins on the table. What's this? She asked. Payment from town, he said. Sold 3 calves today. She smiled wide. Then we're getting closer. He sat across from her, studying her face. There was dust on her, cheeks and ink on her fingers. She looked different from the shy woman who had stepped off the train months ago. Now she moved with quiet strength, he said softly. You've done more for this place than I ever could. She looked up from the papers and met his eyes. No, she said gently. We both did. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The lantern light flickered between them, warm and steady. That night, long after she had gone to bed, Samuel sat on the porch alone, listening to the words she had said were alone. Now let's do what must be done, kept echoing in his mind. Those words carried more than courage. They carried faith. Faith in him, in their home, in something worth saving. He realized then that what had begun as a simple arrangement had become something far deeper. It wasn't about letters or contracts anymore. It was about 2 people who had found each other in the quiet spaces of life and decided to fight side by side. When the first light of dawn touched the land, Samuel stood and looked out across the fields. The grass shimmered with dew. The fences stood firm, and smoke rose gently from the chimney where Elena was already awake making breakfast. For the first time, the future didn't look like an empty road. It looked like home. The months that followed the storm brought both peace and tension. The ranch was finally steady again, the animals healthy, and the fields green. But the quiet of the valley began to stir something new in the town's folk. They had noticed changes. Samuel no longer came to the saloon on Saturdays, and when he did go to town, he was never alone. The mail-order bride, who had once arrived shy and small, now walked beside him with calm confidence. She spoke politely but firmly, and everyone could see that the rancher listened when she spoke. At first, people only whispered. He's changed since she came, one man said at the general store. That woman's got him wrapped around her finger, another replied. Talk grew louder each week, and though neither Samuel nor Elena cared, for gossip, words in a small town travel faster than the wind. One morning, Samuel rode into town to sell some hay and supplies. As he stepped into the store, he could feel the stares. A few men nodded politely, but others smirked behind their hands. Mr. Boyd, the store owner, gave him a small smile and said, "You've done well lately, Sam. Folks say your wife's been helping you keep things running." Samuel nodded. "She has. Couldn't have done it without her." The men near the counter exchanged looks. One of them, a tall man named Carter, laughed. "So, she runs your ranch now, huh? Husby, nice sitting back while the missus handles your business." Samuel froze, his hand tightening around the strap of his bag. "She doesn't run it," he said evenly. "We work together." Carter leaned back in his chair, grinning. "That ain't what people say. Heard she's the one talking to traders and fixing your books. Maybe she ought to wear the pants." The men laughed. Samuel didn't move for a long moment. Then slowly he set his bag down on the counter. The laughter faded when they saw the look in his eyes. His voice was quiet but sharp. "You got a wife, Carter?" The man blinked. "What's that to you? Then maybe treat women with respect before someone teaches you the hard way," Samuel said, his tone steady as stone. "Ellen is my wife. She saved my life in my home. If you ever talk about her again, you'll answer to me." The room went silent. Samuel finished his business, paid for the supplies, and left without another word. Outside, the air was crisp, and the sound of the wind felt cleaner somehow. He rode home slowly, not with anger, but with pride. When he reached the ranch, Elena was tending to the garden. She looked up when she saw him. "You're late," she said softly. "Everything all right?" He didn't answer right away. He tied his horse and walked over, taking her hand. "People talk too much," he said simply. She looked at him carefully. "What did they say?" "Doesn't matter," he replied. "I told them who you are." Her eyes softened, and she smiled faintly. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," he said. "I did." For a moment, neither spoke. The sun was warm on their faces, and the sound of the wind through the grass filled the silence. Then she whispered, "No one ever stood up for me before." He looked at her quietly, realizing how deep those words went. "You don't need anyone to now," he said gently. "But I will anyway." That evening they ate dinner together by the fire. Elena said little, but she kept glancing at him, her heart full of quiet gratitude. When she rose to clear the table, he stopped her hand. "Leave it," he said softly. "Sit with me a while." They sat together on the porch, the sky painted in red and purple. Crickets began to sing in the grass. She leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. "You didn't have to fight for me," she said again, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't fight," he said. "I told the truth." From that night onward, word spread through town that Samuel Harper was not a man to mock, or his wife either. The gossip stopped, and a quiet respect replaced it. Even Carter, the loudest of them all, tipped his hat when he saw Elena at the market. Life returned to normal on the ranch. But something inside both of them had changed. Their bond had grown stronger, deeper, built not on need, but on choice. They worked side by side, shared quiet mornings, and began to understand each other in ways words couldn't explain. One afternoon, while they were fixing the barn roof, Elena slipped and nearly fell. Samuel caught her by the arm just in time, pulling her close. For a brief second, their eyes met, and the world seemed to pause. She looked down, her cheeks warm, and he let her go slowly. "You need to be careful," he said softly. "I am," she replied, smiling. "That's why you're here." That night, as they sat by the fire, he spoke quietly. "When you first came, I didn't know what to expect. I thought you'd leave after the first storm." "I thought about it," she admitted with a small laugh. "But then I saw how much you cared for this place. It made me want to stay." He nodded slowly. "I'm glad you did." The flames flickered between them, warm and steady. It felt like all the miles between two strangers had finally closed. In the weeks that followed, they built more than fences. They built trust. The ranch thrived. Their laughter returned, and even the animals seemed calmer. The people in town no longer saw Elena as a stranger. They saw her as the woman who had helped save the Harper ranch. One morning, an old neighbor stopped by with his wife. They brought pies and fresh milk and spoke kindly to Elena. As they left, the woman said, "You've made this place shine again." After they rode off, Elena looked at Samuel. "Do you hear that?" He smiled. "I hear it." For the first time, she felt like she truly belonged, not just to the house or the land, but to the life they were building together. Later that night, when she stood by the window watching the stars, she heard Samuel's footsteps behind her. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and said softly, "You've made this home again." She turned, her eyes bright in the lamplight. We both did. Outside, the wind rustled through the wheat fields, carrying the scent of the earth. The night was peaceful, the kind of peace that comes only after struggle. In the quiet, Samuel reached for her hand, holding it gently. "You know," he said in a low voice, "I don't hear the silence anymore." She smiled faintly. "Maybe it's because we filled it with life." He nodded, "Looking out into the darkness with you." And in that moment, neither of them felt lonely again. The house that once echoed with emptiness now breathed with warmth, laughter, and quiet love. The kind that doesn't need grand words, only the simple truth of two hearts that chose to stay. Years passed quietly on the Harper ranch. The land that once seemed lifeless was now full of color and sound. Wheat fields waved under the morning wind. Horses grazed peacefully near the stream, and the small wooden house looked warm and lived in. Samuel and Elena had built something steady, a life that wasn't rich with gold, but rich with peace. Each morning, Samuel woke before the sun and found Elena already moving about the kitchen, her hair now stray with silver, but her smile still soft and gentle. The years had touched them both, but their hearts carried a kind of youth that only love and hard work could give. They no longer needed many words. Every small act, his hand fixing a chair, her hand brushing dust from his coat, spoke what their voices didn't. On one cool morning, the air crisp with the smell of rain, Samuel stepped out to the porch. The land stretched wide and, quiet before him, he thought about the day she first arrived, the shy woman, stepping off the train, clutching her small bag, afraid of what was waiting. That memory always came back to him when the world felt too still. He smiled, remembering how uncertain they both had been, and how far they had come since then. When he turned, he saw her standing in the doorway wrapped in a shawl. "Cold morning," she said softly. He nodded. "Colder without you out here." She smiled faintly, her eyes warm. "You always say that." "It's always true," he said. They sat together on the porch as the sun rose. The golden light spread across the fields, and for a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the wind, the birds, and the creak of the old rocking chair beside them. After a while, Elena looked out across the land and said, "Do you remember that storm years ago?" He chuckled quietly. "The one that near took the roof off?" She nodded. "And the fire before that? And the first winter?" Samuel smiled. "I remember every bit of it." She turned her head toward him, her expressions soft. "We've done a lot, haven't we?" He reached for her hand, his rough fingers wrapping around hers, "More than I ever dreamed." For a moment, her eyes glistened, and she whispered, "It was worth it." As days went by, time began to move a little slower. Samuel noticed Elena tired more easily. She still cooked, still worked, in the garden, but sometimes she would pause and hold her chest softly, breathing shallow. When he asked if she was all right, she would smile and say, "I'm just getting old, Samuel." But he knew it was more than that. He could see the faint weakness in her steps, the way she sometimes stared at the horizon as if counting the days. One night, a cold wind swept through the valley. Helena couldn't sleep. She rose quietly and went to the porch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Samuel woke and followed, standing in the doorway. "You should rest," he said softly. "I couldn't," she whispered. "The wind sounds like it used to when I first came here." He stepped closer, standing beside her. "That was a long time ago." She nodded. "Yes, but it feels like yesterday. I was afraid back then. Everything was strange. But now, this is home. Every piece of it. He looked at her, his chest heavy with unspoken words. "You made it home," he said. She turned to him, eyes glistening in the faint light. "We both did." For a moment, the wind softened. The stars above shone bright, and in that quiet, she whispered the words that would stay with him forever. "Do you remember, Samuel? The night of the storm," I said. "We're alone now. Let's do what must be done." He nodded slowly, his throat tight. She smiled faintly. "We did it, didn't we? We built a life. We did what must be done." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. "Yes, we did," he said. A few weeks later, the first snow fell. The air grew cold, the fields turned white, and the nights grew longer. Elena's health began to fade faster. She moved slower, spoke softer, but she still smiled every morning. Samuel stayed by her side, tending to her like she once had tended to him. One morning, she woke before him and asked to sit on the porch to see the sunrise. He wrapped her in a heavy blanket and helped her to the chair, where she loved to sit. The dawn was pale pink, the world still quiet. She looked out and whispered, "It's beautiful, Samuel, just like the first time I saw it." He knelt beside her, holding her hands in his. "It's more beautiful because you're here." She smiled, her breath soft and slow. "Promise me something," she said quietly. "Anything," he said. "When I'm gone," she whispered. "Bury me under the oak tree by the barn. That's where I first felt I belonged." His heart ached, but he nodded. "I promise." She looked at him for a long moment, then whispered, "Thank you for finding me." Even when neither of us was looking, he wanted to speak to tell her how she had changed his life, but words failed him. He just held her hand and let the silence say what his heart could not. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Elena closed her eyes and rested her head against his shoulder. Her breath grew soft, like a whisper fading into the wind. Samuel held her close until he realized she was gone. The days that followed passed like a dream. The house felt too quiet again, too still. Yet it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. This one was full of memories. Every corner carried her presence. Every sound of wind or laughter from the animals reminded him she had once been there. He buried her beneath the oak tree, just as she had asked. The small grave looked peaceful under the shade of its branches. He carved her name into a wooden cross and placed it by her head. Every morning he brought fresh flowers and sat beside her, talking softly as if she could still hear him. Neighbors often passed by the ranch and saw the old man sitting by the tree with his hat in his hands. They would whisper to each other, saying he talked to his wife like she never left. And maybe she hadn't. Some nights, when the wind blew through the valley, Samuel would swear he could hear her voice soft, calm and full of love, whispering the same words she had, spoken long ago. "We are alone now. Let's do what must be done." Years later, when Samuel's own time came, the ranch was still standing strong. The field still grew golden in summer, the barn still smelled of hay, and the oak tree still stood tall. When they laid him to rest beside Elena, the people of Clearwater gathered to say goodbye to the man and woman who had built a life from nothing but courage, trust, and love. And long after both were gone, travelers passing through the valley sometimes said they saw two figures standing together under the oak tree at dawn, a man and a woman, hand in hand, watching the sunrise over the land they built together. The story of Samuel and Elena Harper lived on, not because it was grand or filled with riches, but because it was real. It was a story of two hearts that met in loneliness, stayed through storms, and proved that love isn't born from words or promises. It's built quietly through days of work, small acts of kindness, and the strength to keep going when all seems lost. And so, every sunrise over the Harper Ranch became a reminder that even the quietest love can leave an echo that never fades.